stations. And so you kind of say, well, what is the psychology here? What's happening? I think it's a couple things. Certainly it functions as a luxury belief to the extent that they're insulated from the consequences of those beliefs. I think we can't underestimate two things, however. One is that a lot of these people are just true believers, the people who are most fervent. If you're going to pick up a gun, for example, like Eric Mann did, and shoot it into the window of a police station in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you have to be deeply committed. And I think you see that same spirit among people who are members of Antifa, people who are members of BLM. They are really just possessed by this idea. And I think there's a certain amount of attractiveness for people who are maybe bored, people who maybe feel resentful. They can fuel that resentment and that boredom into revolutionary action. And then they can take the mantle of romanticism. Yeah. You know, they can be Che Guevara. I mean, that's a very attractive figure.
Yeah, unless you know anything about him.
You don't even have to, because you see the cool beret, you see the cool beard, you see the cool kind of high contrast print. And there's a sense of fulfillment, I think, stemming from anger, resentment, a sense of guilt. You have this complex web of emotions that are then manipulated by media, manipulated by activists, manipulated by other leadership. And so there's that latent. I think there's also a sense among people, look, these are my peers. You know, I have a elite education. I've traveled in those circles. I've lived in those cities. There's a sense, I think, among many of my peers, in a way, especially the ones who are left, and I was on the left for many years, kind of graduated rightward over time. There's a sense that that they don't deserve it. There's a deep sense of inferiority.
Yeah. Well, maybe they don't, you know, because one open question. There's an open question here on the guilt front, you know. So there's a gospel discussion of the unequal distribution of talents, right? Because it's pretty clear that if you look at the world as it's presently constituted and always has been, that, you know, some people are more beautiful than others, and some people are healthier, and some people are more intelligent, and some people are more hardworking by nature, and some people are more creative, and some people are more compassionate. There's this massively unequal distribution of a priori resources, right? What you come into the world with, not what you deserve by dint of hard work. And then you might ask yourself, well, if you happen to be born, we'll use all the tropes, white, rich, heterosexual, healthy, attractive, and you have all these benefits and privileges and the luxury of this, let's say, immense wealth that was gathered by your parents, why shouldn't you feel guilty about that? And then what? Because look at all the people who don't have that, and it was just handed to you, it was just laid at your feet. And the answer that's put forward in the New Testament, and I don't like to refer to religious matters unless it's necessary, is that to those to whom much has been given, much will be asked. And so then you might say, well, if you have all this remarkable technological and economic privilege, much of which was unearned, and even much of which, or some of which, was purchased at the cost of historical atrocity, what should you do? And the answer is you should put yourself together so you're as good ethically as you are rich financially. But that's a heavy moral burden and a heavy burden of responsibility. And then I think you can take these cheap and uninformed routes out, and some of that's just based in miseducation and pure ignorance, so that you can accrue to yourself the moral virtue that's necessary to solve your conscience without having to do any of the real difficult work that making a full accounting of your talents and atoning for your privilege would actually require.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. And I think that you have then a group of people who look like me, people who are my age, that are struggling to find an identity, struggling to find a structure, struggling to have a standard of living maybe better than their parents. And then even people who come from wealthy backgrounds, there's a tremendous pressure, right? If you're born to that level of privilege, it's very difficult to maybe exceed your family. In the past, though, we had a kind of paternal structure where you're saying, hey, even you're kind of wayward son of a wealthy family, you have to come into the fold. You have to be a good steward of these resources. You have to, build libraries. You have to build the opera house. You have to do great works that show that you can assume the responsibility of this wealth and prestige and then really provide it back to the community in a substantial way.
Right.
That's very difficult. It's much easier to, put on the keffiyeh, march at a BLM protest, and then, run a family foundation writing checks to a bunch of useless nonprofits. You get the status, you get the prestige, you get the love, you get the identity as a kind of class traitor, but it's an adolescent posture of rebellion from a generation that refuses to grow up and become a father, let's say, or become a mother, become a kind of matriarch figure. And so you have these permanent children that are in eternal revolution against their parents, that for them are symbolically represented in this society. And they feel like they can stuff that feeling or satisfy that feeling with these kind of the sugar high of revolution by play acting. But it deals tremendous damage to real people. And, the reason I'm a conservative, as opposed to where I started 10, 15 years ago as a kind of on the far left, is that I saw in the international context in many places what happens when these ideas take hold. But I also saw, I even spent 5 years in 3 of America's poorest cities observing these communities. The theory of systemic racism, white privilege, intersectionality, etc., all the solutions that they proffer are very good if you want to achieve social status and position in an Ivy League university. They're disastrous once they trickle down or are imposed on poor people of any racial background. And so this feeling, this psychological profile, I think is one of the most important things of our time. I think that's why your work has been so successful and why people on the left have furiously kind of rejected it and in a deranged way, lashed out against it, because you're calling them to responsibility.
I got a funny story for that, man. So, I've had the misfortune to be invited to speak at universities. And I say misfortune because although some of the time that goes quite well, the most disastrous public events of my life have been on university campuses where I'm harassed by student radicals or literally accosted by them, yelled at by unbelievably narcissistic brats, generally harassed a lot by the administration for even daring to go to the damn university, having all sorts of obstacles put in my path when I agree to do so, and then and spending a lot of time and resources to speak to people who are often extremely narcissistic for very little effect. Now, that's not always the case. I've had good experiences at Cambridge and at MIT and at Stanford most recently. And so it can work, but it often doesn't. And so I figured out a way to go to a university and have it work. And this is really quite funny. I figured this out about 5 years ago. So imagine I'm invited to a university and I'm worried that there's going to be protests. And I worry because sometimes there are murderous